and good evening to those of you that might be tuning in from a different time zone. My name is Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, co-run Exile and Bookville, an online bookstore soon to become a brick and mortar space here in Chicago. Today, we are very excited to announce our new reading series, Caoilinn in Conversation, hosted and curated by the inimitable Caoilinn Hughes, author of The Wild Laughter, a staff favorite here at Exile. This series will spotlight and introduce writers of note from Ireland and the UK to our US audience and abroad. Caoilinn will kick off the series by hosting Carys Davies and discussing her new novel, The Mission House. Carys's novel, West, was shortlisted for the Rathbones Folio Prize, a runner-up for the Society of Authors McKitterick Prize, and won the Wales Book of the Year for fiction. Her short collection, The Redemption of Galen Pike, won the Frank O'Connor International Short Story. Carys has won numerous other prestigious awards and was born in Wales, lived and worked for years in New York and also Chicago, and now resides in Edinburgh. Caoilinn's Wild Laughter was shortlisted for the N Post Irish Book Awards Novel of the Year and longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. Her debut, Orchid and the Wasp, won the Collier Bristow Prize and was a finalist for 4 of the prizes. Her short fiction has won numerous other prizes, including the O. Henry, and Caoilinn is a 2021 Writer Fellow at Trinity College Dublin. We couldn't be happier that you agreed to host this reading series, Caoilinn, and look forward to what other talented writers you have in store for us in the future. Two notes before we get started. You can purchase books by both authors through links provided in the chat, or visit our website, exileandbookville.com. As an added bonus, each book comes with a signed book plate. We encourage those of you watching to leave your cameras on, but please stay muted until the Q&A portion, should you have any questions. Please submit those questions in the chat or use the raise hand function, and Caoilinn will put those forth to Carys. I'm gonna get out of the way now and pass this along to Caoilinn. So please enjoy the show. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, Javier. And hello, Carys, and hello, everyone that's in the room. This is a real pleasure to be doing this. The Conversations with Caoilinn series is sort of a thing of dreams, to be able to pick some writers that I really admire. I'm a very, very slow reader and a very, very picky reader. And it does mean that I tend to just read books that I love and abandon ones if I'm not in absolute love. And so with Carys's work, this is just an absolute treat to be able to return to the work and reread it. Carys, are you zooming in from Edinburgh?
Yes,
You are.
I am.
Okay,
yes, still quite locked down up here, sadly.
Is it? Yeah, it is.
It's been a bit slower to move out than England. Yeah.
Than England, okay, right, yeah. It's been a lockdown in Ireland here it was a 5-kilometre restriction for about really nearly 6 or 7 months. And that 5-kilometre has just expanded to your county. So we're able to travel within the county now, which feels, you know, like a county has now become a country.
Yeah.
So we'll be transported to various other places, I think, when we're talking about your work. But I fell in love with your work initially via the short story form. I think the Redemption of Galen Pike was the collection that I discovered, and I because the short form is maybe how I found your work. Maybe if we begin with asking a few questions as to what you write. You know, did you begin as a short story writer, and does the short story inform the way that you work as a novelist?
Definitely. Yes, I did begin with short stories. In fact, I started writing them in Chicago. That's where I first discovered and fell in love with the great American short story writers, Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty and John Cheever and you know, so many more, and started to try and write my own. And so I was writing short stories for many years before I wrote my first novel, West. And actually, when I began West, I assumed that it was a short story because I'd only ever written short stories. And it was a really interesting experience, because it sort of reinforced the fact that, you know, every story has its own form, and you really don't know what that form is until you begin to write it. And with West, I had this sort of 10,000 word thing, which I assumed was a short story, but it was somehow both overburdened and abbreviated. So I sort of puzzled over it and realized, oh, it's a novel. So then there was a very exciting period where I was teaching myself to write a novel, having only ever written short stories.
Wow.
And
okay.
yes, it definitely, I would be a different writer, I think, if I hadn't written short stories, because there are certain things that you do with a short story. And I think my novels, they are quite short story like in their architecture, and in the way that a lot is in between the lines, and endings are very important to me. I'm always sort of moving towards an ending. So I think the overall shape of my novels resembles the shape of a short story. And that's how I have to be able to hold the whole thing in my head, which became quite a challenge with The Mission House, actually, because it was so much longer than anything else that I'd written. So every time I changed something, it was sort of quite exhausting, because I'd have to read the whole thing to sort of feel what was happening to the arc of the story.
So do you tend to know the end then in advance? You tend to know?
No. I mean, that's, I think, another thing that perhaps comes from short story writing, is that you just sort of set off with something, you know, an image or a moment. So no, I absolutely have no idea how things will go. I'm not sure I could write anything if I knew where I was going. That the sort of discovery is all part of the reason I write, to try and figure things out or worry about something.
Yeah, I'm the same. When I'm teaching, I find it a little bit difficult, because you're asking people to submit drafts, and I just don't work in drafts, you know, because by then you know the end.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, I really, for years and years and years, I really didn't know what people meant when they said, "Oh, I'm on my 6th draft" or something. I thought, what even is that? Because for me, it feels much more like a sort of canvas that you're flicking paint at, and it's very, very chaotic. And then it's only really for me at the very end, when I'm going back and forth with my agent and my editor, then I can say, oh yes, you know, this is a draft, and then I've got some comments, and then there'll be another draft. But that's very, very late in the process. Until then, it's really much more of a sort of jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, there's so many questions coming to mind. I hope I remember to ask all of them. But one of them I was thinking about was scale. You know, it's not just about the short form or slightly longer forms. There's some kind of mega theme in your work, I think, you know, a kind of a omnipresent interest in scale. Is that something that resonates or that you've thought about?
How can you amplify that a bit? Scale, what do you mean?
I mean, you know, there's an epic per quality, obviously within a very concise body and form, and it seems as if that tension is vital to your work. That something of the pulse of that that awareness and consciousness of scale is inherent to all of the work.
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly quite a lot of my stories are set in, you know, in huge landscapes. So whether it's the American West or Siberia or the Australian outback, I am very drawn to those really huge landscapes where humans are sort of very, very, very tiny. And when I was writing West, I had this very clear image in my head of a sort of bird's eye view of my hero, you know, like a little ant sort of trekking along, you know, through this very inhospitable landscape. I think there is a real sort of tension that I enjoy, and I think is very productive and powerful, between the compression of the form and that huge landscape, that huge landscape. Does that answer your question?
It does. It's the kind of epic in miniature, I think, descriptor has been used for quite a lot of your work, and that is connected somehow to the other descriptor your work often gets. And in fact, Colin Tobin, I said to him, I was doing an event before this, and I said, I'm about to interview Carys Davies. And I said, do you know her work? And he said, oh, that folkloric, epic, a story. Those were the first words that he came out with. So, and you do see them again. The folkloric, quality is connected to the epic quality. There's the grandness of themes explored in kind of one fell swoop. And I wonder whether the Mission House, your new novel, which is just out in the US, whether there's something in the consciousness of this book where, the protagonist is, maybe he'd prefer the folkloric, he'd prefer the universality, the timelessness and placelessness, the sense of destiny and fatedness, the durability, and all of these aspects of the folkloric, as opposed to the local, the pragmatic, the explosive and fractious. And wonder whether that now is becoming thematically interesting in this book, the tension between these things.
Yeah, I think we'll probably talk about the main character later, but Hilary Bird is, he's not very good at living in the real world. He lives in books, he lives with words, and he's not good at relationships, he's not good with people, and he almost sort of seems to see himself in his own story, almost in his own fairy tale. I think he sort of sees himself as this kind of gnome. He refers to himself as a sort of gnome, and there's another character who he would love to be, who he calls a prince. And it's funny, these things, I wasn't really conscious of them when I was writing the book, but when I stepped back from them, I did think, gosh, the padre, who is this character he's looking for a husband for his adoptive daughter. He's almost like a kind of king in a fairy tale, and you have these effectively three suitors, Hilary Bird, and there's a young Indian boy, and a Canadian missionary. So I think at some level, I don't know if it's because I started writing fiction when my children were very small. So it was a time when I was reading masses and masses and masses of fairy tales. And I remember we had that big Italo Calvino book of the Italian folk tales. It's about sort of this big. And the children loved it and I loved it. And they were these, they're really sort of dark, frightening, but beautiful fairy tales. And I think perhaps that informed the sorts of ostensibly quite simple stories that I wrote. I remember I didn't do a sort of creative writing degree or anything, but I do remember somebody telling me once that in short stories you should avoid high drama. And I remember thinking, damn, I love high drama in a short story, and I like really big things to happen in a short story. And there is, going back to what you were saying, there is this, I love that tension between the really big things happening in this very compressed, formal space.
Yeah, fabulous. It's very gratifying for the reader. Maybe it's helpful for everyone here to hear a bit about the Mission House. So I'll just describe it. Well, Publishers Weekly described it thus: as a captivating, nuanced tale that balances a pervading sense of melancholy with pockets of wry humor. a masterly elegy that's not to be missed. And here to that. And it was a starred review, and a starred review from Kirkus as well. So that was, you know, everyone should read it. is the short way of putting that. It's set in contemporary Tamil Nadu in India, and it opens with a train journey of Hilary Bird, a 51-year-old ex-librarian who has left his London suburb. And in this journey to India, which may or may not have to do with finding himself or leaving something behind. We aren't kind of privy to that as readers. That's a bit glaring, isn't it, that light? We have to have me in the greeny light that we have here. So yeah, we get this character, and we're not quite sure why he's headed to India, what he's running away from or what he's seeking. We're immersed instead of those details and that kind of backstory, we're immersed in the immediate struggles with the environment, his reception of the environment, the heat, and he takes a train into cooler climates, and then he accepts an offer of accommodation by an Anglican priest he meets. And the accommodation is in the temporarily vacant bungalow of a Canadian missionary. And that's the mission house of the title. So it's an idyllic mountainous accommodation. It's a serendipitous circumstance for Hilary Bird to find himself in, to be offered this accommodation, to find the balmy mountainous climate. And so I'm interested in, I'm going to ask Carys to read a section now, that I'm interested in the character's awareness of the serendipity or not, because certainly his host, the Padre, is constantly talking about this fortune and serendipity. So I'm interested in that, and I don't know whether the section that you're going to read speaks to that at all, but it'll be lovely to hear from the book.
Well, I thought I would read a slightly shortened version of the opening chapter, which where we, as you just described, Hilary's arriving. So it will situate us in the town. The novel is told through alternating points of view of a small group of characters. And in this first chapter, we're experiencing everything through the eyes of Hilary Bird himself. As they climbed, the air cooled. By the time they were halfway up, it was chilly and fresh. Thank God, said Bird, gulping the breeze from the open window. And when the Padre asked him what brought him here up into the hills, Bird said, and it felt like the truth, the weather. At modern stores, he bought milk and Nescafe and a packet of Highfield premium tea, a very expensive jar of Hartley's raspberry jam, 2 eggs in a paper bag, and what looked and smelled like a banana muffin, which he planned to eat in the morning for his breakfast. The Padre had told him about a shortcut that would bring him out of the hectic town to the presbytery on the hill above the church. And from the high pavement outside modern stores, he could see the church's white spire pointing like a compass needle into the misty sky above the messy pattern of tiled and corrugated roofs and the floaty, lightly moving tops of the trees. There it is, he said aloud, because it was reassuring to be able to see exactly where he was going. Carrying his shopping and his straw hat and pulling his suitcase over the broken surface of the road, he moved towards it until he came to the broad concrete steps the Padre had described. Up he went. On his left, a group of women in bright clothes hacked at the ground with small sharp tools that flashed in the weak sunlight. Then, just as the Padre had told him they would, the steps delivered him out onto a steep road above the town, at a gateless opening surrounded by thick vegetation. A crooked sign on the right-hand side said, "Dog is on duty." Bird walked in under a canopy of dripping trees, along a red earth driveway puddled with water. There was no sign of any dog or the padre. The bungalow was there, though, in the garden next to the presbytery, as the padre had promised, the door open invitingly. How tired he was, how exhausted after his weeks wandering about down on the plains, the temples and the dusty museums, the endless hotel rooms, the uncomfortable nights spent on buses and trains, the awful clamour of the auto rickshaw drivers, the intolerable heat. In the cool of the evening, he walked through the small square rooms of the little bungalow, a sitting room with a fireplace and an etching of a Scottish lock and a neat round table. In the corner, a green fridge. A veranda-like room closed in with windows containing a desk and a huge extraordinary chair like a dentist's. A bedroom with a three-quarter bed, an embroidered placard on the wall above it that said, "I will be your shield, your high tower, the horn of your salvation." A bathroom with a toilet and a sink and a big pink plastic bucket like a dustbin. A kitchen with a blue propane bottle and a two-burner stove. Another sink and shelves lined with clean newspaper. "Ideal pigeon," it said in black script on the front of the stove's white enamel. "Well, isn't this nice?" he said aloud. He boiled the eggs and made himself a cup of tea. He unpacked his things and stowed his suitcase under the bed. He walked through all the rooms again, closing the open windows and drawing all the curtains. It was hard to imagine anything more cozy and snug. In the kitchen, he put a pan of water on to boil, then two more, until there was enough hot water in the pink bucket in his bathroom for him to stand in it and wash himself. There was still a crust of salt around his middle from the sweat that had collected there in the heat of the morning and dried when the train reached the cool air of the mountains. It gave him such pleasure to see it dissolve and disappear beneath the wet sponge. And then there was the novelty of putting on his pajamas, which he hadn't worn since leaving home. It was late when he noticed the other man's clothes hanging limply from a forked hook on the back of the bedroom door. The door was open against the wall, and when he closed it, there they were, a red and blue plaid shirt and a pair of dark, many-pocketed trousers, a hat with ear flaps and a pom-pom. It amazed him what he felt when he saw them, how much he would have preferred it if they weren't there, how much in the few short hours since he'd arrived, he'd come to think of the place as his own. He pushed the door back against the wall so that the clothes of the absent missionary were, as they'd been before, out of sight. On his pillow, a hot water bottle lay in a woolen cover, and he thought about boiling another pan to fill it, but he was so very tired now, and instead he climbed into the three-quarter bed and let his head sink into the cool pillow. For a little while he read, but soon his eyes began to close, and his last thought before he slept was how lucky it was that he and the padre had boarded the same carriage at Metapolyum. How lucky that they'd fallen into conversation after his joyous "thank God" when halfway up the air had cooled. What a stroke of good fortune it was that this little bungalow was lying here in this pretty, if slightly neglected and overgrown garden, empty and available. I'll leave it there.
Lovely, lovely. And that speaks to the framing of that serendipitously. In fact, it's funny, the gladder bird gets, the more unnerved the reader gets, I think. We get this, he is, there is the padre has an adoptive daughter, Priscilla, and Bird, over the course of, the coming weeks and months, he teaches her baking and English and sewing, and he begins to see the possibility of her having, a good life, and he feels that he's improving her life, and this kind of sense of gladness increases. And in the background, there's tension arising very subtly in the novel. It read so differently on the second read for me, because I hadn't noticed it so much. I'd been too close to Bird, but that background tension from the town, particularly regarding the presence of foreigners, as the country's kind of having this shift towards nationalism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you also, in the writing of this, were along with Bird, where in your drafting or in the early stages of the writing, you also were oblivious to a certain extent, until you became aware of Bird's very strange subjectivity.
Well, there's several really interesting points. So it's interesting that you say that you didn't pick up on some of those things as you go through, and in a sense that's always a risk when you've got a main character who isn't very observant, who's misunderstanding and misreading so much of what's around him and is oblivious to it. So he's really not picking up on these signals. But yes, absolutely. I mean, maybe this might be a good time for me to talk a little bit about what was sort of going on in my head when I was, over the years that I was writing this novel, because that sort of obliviousness is a really big part of that. I had been writing about this man, about this sort of Hilary Bird figure, after I'd been in India in 2011, but it wasn't really until 2016 that I realized how oblivious I'd been to the rise in Hindu nationalism when I'd been in India in 2011, and so I'd been writing about this depressed man, and then 2016 happened, Brexit happened, Trump happened, and I was just poleaxed by my failure to see what had been coming. This sort of that this twin nightmare could have happened, and it made me reevaluate what I had and hadn't seen when I was in India, because by the time Brexit and Trump happened, Modi had already been in power for a couple of years on an openly Hindu nationalist agenda, and anti-Muslim and anti-Christian violence was on the increase, as it had been when I'd been there in 2011. But I just hadn't twigged. And it's like what George Orwell wrote an essay in the 40s about how, as humans, we're very, very good at seeing things, but tuning them out, not seeing them. And it's a real struggle to sort of make ourselves confront these things. So I think all that started to feed into into this character, who I already knew was a very introspective kind of person, very depressed person, and it seemed to be part of his story that he would be in this former British hill station, surrounded by the relics of the British imperial past, but not connecting that with this nationalistic present, that sort of obliviousness was part of who Bird was. And I think it was also a way for me of writing about my experience and the shock that I'd had in 2016, that there'd been this tide of nationalism and nativism and xenophobia and nostalgia, and I'd seen it, but I hadn't realized how powerful it was.
Because it's connected a little bit to West as well. The extinctions, the various extinctions that novel is about, were you kind of aware of that when you started this novel, that there was something going on there in conversation between the two books?
you know, I wasn't really, even though the writing of the two was, you know, were slightly parallel. I actually started this book several years before I started West, but I was in New York with Jean and Laurel in New York writing West. You know, when we were all there when the election happened, and I just left the UK. I just left the Brexit vote behind, and so it was a while though before I realised that Hilary does have quite a lot in common with the main character in West, Cy Bellman. You know, they're both these sort of, well, Cy is effectively, I mean, he's only 35, but this is the early 19th century, so he's kind of middle-aged. These two middle-aged white men sort of blundering about in territories which they don't understand. Neither of them really have a sense of their own complicity or their place in history, and they also both of them have a sort of close yet distant relationship with, you know, with another male character, Cy with his Native American boy guide, and Hilary Bird with his driver Jamshid. And just as Cy never for a moment thinks, oh, my Pennsylvania farm is built on land that's been stolen from this boy who's helping me. Similarly, Bird, although he's in the library most days, he's reading about the imperial past of the town, he doesn't reflect on that.
Yeah, and he, you know, it's interesting. I hadn't seen that parallel with the kind of helper character as well, but that's interesting. In the Mission House, it's a rickshaw driver who Bird hires to. He spends his days kind of visiting British-built sites and reading historical books in the imposing Victorian library. And there's a nostalgic quality to that that's quite compelling. But he's hired this rickshaw driver called Jamshed, and Jamshed has a voice in the novel. It's a multiple narrative story, and you know, so he really becomes kind of central to the novel. But you know, as Hilary's in the back of the cab, he's monologuing, you know, and almost like a therapist's couch. And I wonder what it is in him that hasn't always been in his life, this failure to connect.
There's a sort of closedness to him. He's very he really struggles with intimacy, and that's a big, I mean, I don't want to give too much away about what happens at the end of the novel, but there's a particular phrase that's used quite often to describing his feelings, which is that he feels both guilty and afraid in India, that he feels guilty because he knows that he probably has things that he could give people, but he doesn't want to, and he's always suspicious and thinks that people want things from him that they don't necessarily. So I think this fearfulness and this closedness, it prevents himself from being able to open up to other people, and he's conscious that he's feeling better than he's felt for a long time in this new place, but he never realizes that much of the reason why he's feeling better is because of the relationships around him. He's being treated with kindness and respect and being made to feel useful and important, which I think a lot of the time he doesn't. And you mentioned the teaching of Priscilla. He teaches her to read, and he teaches her to sew and bake. And in his younger years, he thought, well, I would quite like to be a teacher, but he was much too frightened. So she helps him to overcome that. And there's a moment in the novel where Bird has locked himself out of his bungalow, and Priscilla helps him to get back into the bungalow, and she's saying, oh, you know, you've closed all the windows in here. You shouldn't close the windows because everything will get damp. You know, you need to open all the windows. So it's a very significant moment because they throw open the windows, and Bird sort of feels a physical kind of opening, that he's opening himself to the fresh sky, and this is a big shift for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this is definitely coming to the point now where the more you speak, the more questions I want to ask, and the time is collapsing. But one of the things that I think I'd be remiss not to bring up is the fact that you do write from, both in this and in West, write from a perspective, a demographic that's very far from your own. And I do think conversations about this can be so antagonistic and strangely you know, uncomfortable. And I really like, whenever this comes up with students, I usually bring up Alexander Chee, who wrote a really great essay in Vulture about this, and he kind of gives a recommendation of 3 questions for writers to ask themselves. So I like that it's questions, you know, rather than edicts. And he says, you know, why do you want to write from this character's point of view? Do you read writers from this community already? So kind of, you know, take a look at the bookshelf, and why do you want to tell this story? And maybe because this is such a challenge, you know, to pull off. I wonder what your approach to this was.
Yeah, yeah, it is a challenge, and you certainly, I was very sort of conscious in a way that, yeah, I was putting my head above the parapet with, you know, all the discussion around this. But when I was writing West, you know, I had this character, old woman from a distance, a young Native American boy, and for so long I sort of circled around him and thought, oh, well, perhaps he could just be this kind of mysterious person that we never really get inside. But when I was researching the novel, I spent, you know, many long hours in the manuscripts library at the New York Public Library, looking through all these records of this period. And what you cannot help but see is that there were no Native American voices. There was just this huge silence. And I thought, I can't, you know I'm not Native American, but I can't just add to this silence. It felt like a really terrible thing to do. So I felt I had to try and give him a voice. And all you can do is, you know, you use all your imagination and empathy and compassion and insight and intelligence and research and care, and try and get it right. And then with this book, I think what I feel is that I couldn't have written this story if I hadn't inhabited all those other characters as well, because it's a story about fault lines, and that, you know, that place where very, very different people from completely different backgrounds meet, and what do they think of each other and how do they interact. And if you're concerned with that fault line, then you have to gird your loins and try and get it right. And, you know, I mean, I always knew that I wasn't writing a big Indian novel. I was writing this story which was about Britain and India, but I did feel that it was a small community that I knew well. So the scope of the story itself wasn't something I consciously researched. It was something I felt. The characters are fictional, but they're based on what I know, all the rhythms of all the speech. Those are things I know and felt I could render exactly, and with feeling and compassion.
Yeah. And there's, you know, an interesting, maybe I'm too interested in the meta qualities of what's contained within our works and the context of the works themselves or something. But in both your novels, the characters have to they seek kind of distance, or they go to great distances in order to be able to understand themselves, maybe, and they take these kind of vantage points. The novels take these vantage points to tell the characters' stories, you know, these kind of helicopter, these, you know, zooming in and out. And I wonder whether or not that's true of your own kind of writing, that, you know, you benefit from distancing in some way. You know,
Definitely.
Could you write a novel set in
I mean, the fact that a lot of my main characters are very often men. I mean, I do write a lot of women as well, but I'm conscious in this book, you know, Priscilla she's the only woman, and I think there is something about getting a long way, as far away as possible from my own life. But it's curious because I still, you know, I can see a lot of myself in Hilary Bird, for instance. You know, it's not that I'm not present, but I seem to have to get a very long way from my own life, either geographically or historically, to set my imagination free. Yes.
Yeah, I can understand that. You know, I got asked about the wild laughter, why I said it in Roscommon, which is adjacent to where I'm from, Galway, but it's landlocked, which makes a very big difference in the level of manic depression and so on in Ireland. It's seriously wet and boggy, and so I got, you know, some abuse from Roscommoners as to why did you have to write such a grim story set in Roscommon, make it your own hometown. But, you know, but deep down they understood it had to be Roscommon. I'll ask you one last question, and then I'm going to scan the chat to see if there are questions from the audience. I always get asked if I think of myself as being an Irish writer because I've lived in so many places, and I know you've lived in so many places, so I'm curious as to whether or not you feel yourself to be a Welsh writer.
No, I don't. I'm always very nervous about going to do readings in Wales because, you know, I have this incredibly Welsh name, and I am totally Welsh. I mean, all my family is from Wales, going way back. But, you know, I sound like this because I haven't lived there since I was 10. So I mean, I'm, you know, proud to be called a Welsh writer, but I don't really think of myself as particularly an anywhere writer. Wherever I've been, I've always felt slightly on the outside. You know, I was a Welsh teenager in England, and then I was British in America for 12 years, and now I'm a Welsh person in Scotland, but everyone thinks I'm English because of how I sound. So it's and I think that inevitably means you're always slightly reflecting on your relationship with where you are. So a lot of my characters, they are, you know, they're transplanted to Siberia or the Australian outback or yeah.
I will, and there's a question here that looks compelling. Your very crisp etching of place and person places us so firmly into a scene on all sensory levels. I've always been struck, that's very true, you do tend to write in scenes. I've always been struck by the theatrical and cinematic aspect of your writing, almost Hardy-like. Are you ever tempted to write a play or a screenplay?
I've never written a play or a screenplay. Sometimes what I will do, if I'm a bit stuck with a story is I'll make myself write the whole thing in dialogue or something, just to try and kind of, you know, if I can't hear the voices, I can't write the scene. And actually, if I can't see the scene, you know, all the scenes, they kind of unfold in my head like a film, and I have to be able to do that. So that the scene, for instance, with Bird on the train, you know, I see him going up on this little train. It's interesting about the sort of the presentness of the scenes in the question. I think that might be something that comes from writing short stories for a long time. You know, they don't have much truck with too much backstory. And I remember doing a reading with David Constantine, the British short story writer, and he sort of put up his hand and said, "Beware the pluperfect tense." And I've always remembered that. It's sort of, have I got too much pluperfect tense in here? Because it does, it kind of, you suddenly feel everything just kind of dragging down and slowing down. I mean, I do use the pluperfect tense, but I think it does, writing short stories does anchor you in a very sort of intense present.
Yeah. Somebody has said, if Willa Cather fit into your inspiration or influences?
That's so interesting, because I did go on a real Willa Cather jag during lockdown, and absolutely just was blown away by Death Comes for the Archbishop. That, you know, that's a story about landscape and spirituality, and it's just one of those books. You know, so many books, so many novels you read, and you're kind of thinking, okay, I see how this is done. And then you read something like that and you think, how is she doing this? How is she doing this? So yes, I just finished reading Song of the Lark, actually. So yes, and I've just started Hermione Lee's biography of Willa Cather as well.
Lovely. So whoever asked that was onto it. Would be interested to know if Carys begins her stories inspired by a character she's conjured by, or by exploring an issue she's interested in exploring.
Definitely the former. I'm always so conscious when, you know, when you've written a novel and then your publisher and your publicist and, you know, that whole thing gets going, and you have to start talking about where the novel came from and how you wrote the novel, and I think you start thinking, well, gosh, what is this about, in a way that you don't when you're writing it. You're just telling a story. So when I was talking earlier about everything that was going on with obliviousness and Brexit and all those things, I think I'm much more conscious of that in retrospect than at the time. I mean, it sounds extraordinary. How could I not have been completely conscious of that all the time? But you know, you're immersed in your characters, and not themes. I've never set out to write about a theme or an idea. Those things sort of come through the story.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me as well. Sometimes it can sound like that afterwards when you talk about a novel. It can sound like you must have set out to write about these topics, especially when you're writing kind of socially interested work, as you are.
And you know, things, you know, there is so much serendipity and extraordinary things happen. Like with West, I just started with this one idea that I'd read about how in the early 19th century, a lot of people did think that maybe mammoths were still alive in the West. And at that point, I had no notion that this would drop me into a historical setting where there was another kind of threatened extinction. I would have these two threads of extinction that's just something, you know, it's the discovery.
Yeah, and you, I mean, one of the things about West and about this novel is that either of them could have become quest novels or heroes' journeys in which the hero finally discovers their deepest strength in order to overcome, the challenges they're faced with, or they could have become picaresques also, because they're moving through social spaces, and neither of them are any of those things. Did you ever have to resist a pattern impulse?
I was very conscious writing West that people would probably, it's a sort of Western epic. I was conscious that people would be expecting a certain kind of novel. And I think there was a big part of me that was thinking, no, I'm not going to give you that. So they, Sigh and An Old Woman from the Distance could have gone from this adventure to the, series of adventures. And I very consciously didn't want it to be that sort of book, for sure.
Yeah. I think this might be our last question, but you've all been so wonderful, and it's been really lovely seeing everybody's faces. This is new. The last time it was just myself and another person. In describing your background, it seems as if you could almost be, this is from Louise Tutelian. Sorry for mispronouncing that, undoubtedly. Describing your background, it seems as if you could almost be writing from a kind of expat perspective at times, an outsider looking in. Could you speak to that, please?
I think, as I was saying earlier, I think I always have had that feeling of being on the outside. When I was living in America, I loved living in America. I adore America, and I was so happy there. But I don't, not a single day went by that I wasn't conscious of being, a little bit to one side. So it's interesting. I do. You're right. I do seem to take people and put them elsewhere. That seems to happen over and over and over again. So I think there's a lot in that.
Wonderful. It's been fabulous hearing more about this book, and I hope that everyone is inspired to read it. And thank you to Javier and to Kristen from Exile and Bookfell. Is there anything, Javier, you want to come in with?
Oh yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and to Caoilinn and Carys for taking time out of their evening to deliver such great conversation. That was fantastic. If you'd like to revisit this, we post all of our events on our YouTube channel and on our website, exileinbookville.com. You can also purchase The Mission House and The Wild Laughter, as well as other works by our guests, through our website that will come with signed book plates. This is such a lovely way to start Caoilinn's new reading series, Caoilinn in Conversation, and we look forward to who and what Caoilinn brings next to the show in June. Sign up for our newsletter through our website for updates on that and our other upcoming events. That was fantastic. Thanks everyone for your patience today for what happened this afternoon. And hope to see you guys next time. If Caoilinn and Carys, we can just hang around a little bit after everyone signs off. Bye everyone. Thank you. Good to see you, Lauren.
Thanks for coming. So great to see you all.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Lovely. Thanks. Bye.